Hi, and welcome to our second session in our series called Endgame, where we're looking at the book of Revelation. Just a quick recap from our first session. We are covering the first of the three themes in the book of Revelation. The first theme is good versus evil. And we spent the first session looking at the fact that there is personal evil in the world. That at some level humanity is broken, and try as we may in our own strength, we as humans for thousands and thousands of years have not been able to solve some of the evils that we have unleashed on ourselves and on the world. But in order for God to take us to the end game where He makes all things right and we have a new heaven and a new earth, God needs to deal with the personal evil. We told the story of a heart surgeon who actually has to go in and deal with the problems on the inside, and things have to get worse before they get better. In fact, that reminds me actually of a story of an actual heart surgeon in our church. And I remember one Sunday where one of his patients came to our Sunday service, and he brought his whole family along. And this man came up to me, the patient came up to me and was glowing about his review of this surgeon who attends our church, who I'll remain anonymous, right? And he said, "This man saved my life. I was going to die." You know, we sing this song, "What a Beautiful Name," when we talk about Jesus. And I think we cannot understand what a beautiful name Jesus is unless we first recognize how grave our problem is. That we're actually like that person with a heart attack, with a death sentence. And that we need to be then thankful for the surgeon who's come in, who's basically opened us up, operated on us, and gave us a new lease on life. When we view God as that surgeon, it is then that we are able to say, what a beautiful name. We need to be at this state where we are willing to address the issues in our life at whatever cost. When a person goes down on the operating table, they basically almost at death's bed. And the anesthetist has to keep that person alive just so that operation can take place. I think one of the reasons why the book of Revelation is so powerful is that it introduces us to a God who is mighty to save, and that He is dealing and has dealt with our human evil, and that we get to share eternity with Him. But in part 2 of this series, we look at another aspect of good versus evil. You see, in chapter 6, where we kind of left off, I'll summarize Revelation chapter 6 for you. Bad things happen, terrible things happen, and then more bad things happen, right? But then we get to chapter 7, chapter 8, and then we go to chapter 9. And it is in chapter 9 that we discover the main theme of this second session, Satan. Good versus evil has a second part, which is we have an adversary. We are not alone in this world. You know, in Australia, we tend to think that all of our issues and our problems are natural, right? We counsel people about their depression. We tackle our day-to-day sins and our issues in sort of natural ways, whether it be through problem solving or brainstorming or throwing money at issues. We seldom, in Australia and in the West, look at a supernatural adversary. Yet, the Bible makes it very clear that we meet Satan in Genesis, and that Satan shows up in the book of Revelation. Satan, actually, we use it as a proper noun for Satan, but it actually just means adversary, and he's got many, many names. Revelation makes it clear that we have this adversary. That means we cannot just raise up Christians nowadays that are healthy and that can survive and get along and deal with the problems of this world. We can't just do that. You can't just come to church and be an okay Christian. We need to raise up Christians that can battle and stand up against an adversary. Satan is against God, and he is against us. He's promising us all kinds of things, but he deceives. In Revelation 9 verse 1, it says this, "And the fifth angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to earth, and he was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. And he opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke from the shaft." And he goes on to describe what happens. This fallen star, which the Bible in the Old Testament calls Lucifer, is introduced. And then you get these locusts, you get the smoke, and then these disasters. In verse 11, it says that all of these bad things, the scorpions and the locusts, they have as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek he is called Apollyon. Let me summarize it. We have an enemy. That is a major theme in the book of Revelation. You know, all kinds of bad things happen then as a result of this adversary. So not just because of our personal evils, but also because we have an enemy. 1/3 of mankind is killed. We see the different types of adversaries, from Satan to the prostitute, to the false prophet, to the beasts, to the antichrist. We have a range of adversaries. These are sentient, intelligent, cunning, somewhat powerful enemies. And we cannot be wishy-washy Christians against such an adversary. We need to be on guard. Our faith can't get rocked when we fail an exam, or the air conditioner doesn't work at church, or you know, some leader didn't greet us or smile on a Sunday. We cannot be so easily fallen away from the faith, because the end times are coming, and all of these things will be tested in battle. That's what the book of Revelation says. So the first thing we need to do is be aware. We need to be aware of this adversary. It's not just God in this world. It's not just your parents that are the source of all problems in life. It's not just the economy that needs to be fixed. It's not just our prime minister and who we elect. It is not just humanity that is responsible for problems. We have a spiritual adversary. So let's tackle that well. You know, Matthew chapter 7 has actually some insight into how we can handle, I guess, some of the onslaught that is to come. You may not realize that this very famous parable is a parable about the end times, but it is. So let's turn to it, and I'd like to read a little bit before this famous parable, just so that we get the context of where it's coming from. Because while it has application in our life today, it is very clearly also a parable about the end game. In Matthew 7, verse 15, you see Jesus tell the first parable, I guess, in this series. And he says, "Beware of false prophets that come to you in sheep's clothing." And it says that basically there will come a time where we will get deceived. So we got to look at the fruit of what the prophet says. But this false prophet is spoken about in the book of Revelation. Then you get in chapter 7, verse 21, another kind of parable or saying. And it begins with Jesus saying, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." And then in verse 2 are these words that are a clue that we're talking about the end times. It says in chapter 7, verse 22, "On that day, many will say to me," on that day, many will say to me, "Lord, Lord, did we not do all these things in your name?" What is that day? On that day is the day of judgment. It is the day in Revelation. Both of these parables have eschatological ramifications. That means they have ramifications for the end game. They lead up to this very famous parable. Most of us don't think it's about the end, but it is. And it says in Matthew 7, 24 to 27. It is the parable of building your house on the rock. Verse 24 says, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and they beat on the house. But it did not fall, because it was founded on the rock." When it talks about the rain and the disasters and the wind and all that, it's supposed to remind you of the book of Revelation, of the times when terrible things happen. These storms aren't just the normal everyday storms of our world and our life right now. It also foretells of a great storm that is coming. So how do we remain faithful when we are faced with our adversary and with our troubles? This passage says we need to build on the rock. It's like the old Christian saying, we need to hear and obey. Not just be listeners of the word, like the foolish man who builds his house on the sand, but like the wise man who hears and then builds his house through obedience in the words of Christ. If we stand on the rock, even if we die, we will win. That is the message of the book of Revelation. That's why you get all of these, the martyrs. That's why you get the faithful 144,000. Because we make it all the way, if we stand on the rock, we make it all the way to the end. And God says, "I do know you." If we don't prepare ourselves for battle with an enemy, or we don't even realize that we have an enemy, we might be tempted to just blame people or fight with people. But the book of Revelation makes it clear that we are not fighting just people, that we're fighting against principalities and powers. And in fact, we have an adversary whose name is Satan. We are in the face of this battle to remain faithful and true by sticking with what God's word says. In fact, we will then discover that as we get to God's end game, that not only does God win at the end, but that Jesus himself is the one who is faithful and true. I hope that you will see as we study this second theme in the book of Revelation, that God's end game is to actually defeat our adversary. God bless.